Welcome, everybody. I'm Brian O'Leary, Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group, and we appreciate you coming today to hear from a team of folks led in particular by Jack Stevens from Woodland Group, talking about the future of global shipping, key trends, and strategies. If you're a regular attendee at our Lunch and Learns, you'll remember that last month we talked about global procurement, a session led by Kevin Spall from Scholastic. And it's a good 1-2 punch in many ways to hear from Jack and his colleagues today, talking about the implications for global strategy or global shipping. There's a lot going on in the world. We'll touch upon at least some of that, but Jack has been sure to leave time for your comments and questions. If you have things as Jack is presenting that you want to add, put it in the chat. We'll be monitoring that and we'll bring those questions up. If you have something longer and or more complicated, we'll probably ask you to unmute and contribute as well. Thank you very much for being here, and I'm going to turn things over to Jack.
Thanks, Brian. Hi everyone. Thanks for joining. Hope you all had a nice Thanksgiving break. Looking forward to the last few weeks of the year. I've just got a few slides, 10-15 minutes to kick things off, and then, as Brian said, myself and my colleagues will be happy to take any questions, any further comments for the remainder of the time. Unfortunately, Adrian Blackman, who some of you will recognize from BISG annual lunch the last couple of years, was unable to join us. So, as Brian said, you're stuck with me for the first 10 minutes, but I've also got Susie Scally, who you may also recognize from the BISG annual lunch over the last few years. Dave Burnham, a partner and colleague of ours from the UK, who has just as much experience in the book supply chain industry as Adrian and Susie, but from a UK and European perspective. And I've got a couple of other colleagues, Mark Demianchik and maybe Dan Williams on the call as well, and we can all sort of support with any questions that you may have at the end. There was a paper published by Descartes just this week that cited these as some of the top challenges that businesses are expecting to face in 2025 when it comes to international trade. And thankfully, as this was only published yesterday, these headings tied in nicely with the few slides that I'd already prepared. So I wonder how closely these challenges here align with your own that you're considering. And we're going to touch on pretty much all of these challenges over the next few slides. So let's start with what we do know. Firstly, looking ahead to Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year in 2025. This is earlier next year than it was in 2024, and in fact, earlier than 2026 as well, falling on January 29th, which means the sort of entire holiday and industrial shutdown period will likely run at least from the 28th of January through to the 4th of February. As we know, this puts increased pressure on space and pricing in the run-up to the holiday. And then typically we can expect to see that backlog hit the US ports anywhere between 2 to 6 weeks later, depending on the sailing schedule. Can see here just a rough illustration of the potential impact of missing any of those pre-Chinese New Year departures. So you'll be looking to add at least 2 weeks onto your arrival time into the US, plus that sort of doesn't account for any backlog time that the US ports will then be experiencing. So same as every year, a real effort to try and get as much out for that Chinese New Year deadline as possible. What else do we know about US and Canadian port challenges next year? Labour shortages and labour challenges that we've heard a lot about in the news. So you'll recall the East and Gulf Coast port strikes in October this year, which thankfully only lasted 3 days after the ILA tentatively accepted a $4 per hour increase for its members for every year for the next 6 years. However, unfortunately, no real progress was made on the issue of port infrastructure modernization and automation, which is something that the ILA union strongly oppose, despite not a single US port ranking inside the top 50 globally for productivity, which is quite a shocking statistic. And it's this point around automation that is expected to trigger a second walkout on the 15th of January next year. So that is something that, although far from being confirmed, is expected to happen at the moment. A second strike on the East Coast ports on the 15th of January. And as that's just 5 days before the next presidential inauguration, it's unlikely that the incumbent government will intervene during those 5 days. So we're expecting to see that strike for at least 1 week, but potentially longer. The US Chamber of Commerce has predicted that a 30-day strike would have an economic impact of over $1 billion per day. Canada was not immune from its own port strikes. This year, they had strikes on both coasts, east and west, in Q4 this year. These are largely, again, rooted in concerns around pay, but also around automation. And whilst the Canadian government did step in to mediate last month in November, the relations there are still far from perfect. So further strikes in the Canadian ports can't be ruled out at this stage. Thinking about regulatory compliance, we'll leave tariffs aside as we'll cover those slightly separately, but there are a few other regulatory compliance implications to keep an eye on for next year too. The newly formed Department of Government Efficiency has said that the CBP and the Department of Commerce are not beyond their reach. And I think that the most likely impact here will not necessarily be a reduction in regulation, but an increase in the automation and efficiency in the way inbound shipments are screened and processed. In an ideal world, if this goes to plan, that will manifest itself as a smoother process for compliant importers, but may pose some issues for less compliant importers. Our brokerage teams and compliance teams are sort of always happy to review any new scenarios with you around any new products that you might be looking to import, new suppliers, new origins, that kind of thing. Definitely before you commit to shipping, and ideally even before you sort of finalize your production runs, it's best to get those compliance checks done as soon as possible. So sort of recommendations to combat these challenges are just remaining vigilant and having a diverse range of options, both at origin and destination, available to you. And we can discuss those more. If we think now specifically about exporting to the UK and the EU, so even if the ex-German Chancellor, Angela Merkel's new autobiography, released last week, stirred some old Brexit emotions in the UK and Europe, at least the dust has settled from a trade compliance perspective. So at least we know the lay of the land, where we stand. Strong sales of English language books into the EU, which I hear is at least partially attributable to the success of BookTok, sort of book-related TikTok activity, as well as the EU being a growing alternative print location, means that the EU is only likely to become more of a strategic location at both ends of the publishing supply chain. Our own locations in the US, UK, and the EU, our AEO status, in-house brokerages, and door-to-door tracking mean that we load these lanes really, really well. And my colleague Dave from WBS, who I mentioned at the top, is on hand to take any sort of specific UK and EU related questions later in the session. When we think about the EU, we should also think about the CETA, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Arrangement between Canada and the EU, that allows for streamlined tariff and regulation procedures into the EU. So just something else to consider as part of any sort of scenario or sourcing diversification plans that you may have, that Canada to the EU routing option. Thinking about some new and upcoming EU trade requirements. First, we have ICS2. Phases 1 and 2 of this import control system focused on air freight and began in 2021. But tomorrow, the 4th of December, marks the somewhat delayed start of phase 3 of ICS2, in which House Bill of Lading level information will need to be filed with the European destination directly. The data elements to do this are not onerous and are very similar to those that are required for an ISF filing for imports into the US. But it's just something to be aware of. Your current forwarder should be able to handle these filings for you, no problem. But you may notice an increase in the information requested by your forwarder in order to handle these filings completely. A second piece of EU regulation is the CBAM. Both the EU and the UK are sort of in the early-ish phases of introducing their respective carbon border adjustment mechanisms, slated to come into full effect in Jan 26 for the EU and Jan 27 for the UK. Whilst these are both initially likely to target more carbon-intensive industries than book publishing, I think it would be wise to assume that they may broaden their reach further down the road. Again, something that we are well placed to help with is our internal sustainability manager, Sam Warren, who some of you may have had calls with already. He's actually chair of the UK Industry Policy Group. And before he was placed in that position, Woodland won their inaugural sustainability award. So again, Sam, very happy to discuss the impacts of any of these things with you. Similarly, our recommendations here are just to try and be ahead of the curve when it comes to any of these regulatory or compliance related issues, because we tend to get a sort of decent notice period and runway going into them, but once they start, the penalties can often start pretty severely. Finally, I mentioned tariffs, and I'm not going to try and make any wild predictions here, but just understand what happened previously regarding tariffs and what can be learned from that, and therefore what might happen again. During the first Trump administration, we heard a lot about Trump tariffs. However, given that the Biden administration then maintained and even expanded some of these, it seems fairer to refer to these tariffs imposed on goods imported from China as Section 301 tariffs, which is the section of the Trade Act that is used to implement them. We know, of course, that books under the HTS code heading of 4901 remain directly unaffected, but were subject to a 301 China levy of 7.5%, which is actually down from the 25%, which is applied to many other commodities under Section 301 from China. There are some exclusions to this, one of these being children's books under HTS Chapter 4903, who don't have to pay the 7.5%. What's going to happen come January or beyond? We don't know, but the new administration, they will have a variety of options at their disposal when it comes to implementing any new tariffs, should they choose. If they decided to use Section 301 again, there will at least be a nominal investigation and notice period. But in this case, the tariffs can be implemented as quickly as 6 months, which was the case in 2018. However, if more of a national security angle is put forward, that timeline can shrink from months to days if they choose to use a presidential proclamation or executive order. Trump has also turned his tariff sights on China's BRIC allies last week, or over the weekend, a series of angry tweets about this. So BRIC's fellow founding members, Brazil, Russia, and India, and the newer members, including South Africa, Ethiopia, Iran, Egypt, and the UAE. Here, the focus is on the potential aim of the BRICS, who may be looking to de-dollarize, and that's something that Trump says he'll treat with 100% tariffs. And this is where I think it's also important to consider the idea of potential retaliatory tariffs from other countries on US exports. As I know from sitting here in our New Jersey warehouse facility today, just the volume of books that we export from here to some of those BRICS countries on a daily basis. And finally, the sort of recent tariff target was pointed at US neighbors in Canada and Mexico, both of whom he said could be on the receiving end of 25% tariffs in order to combat illegal immigration and drug smuggling. Whether or not books sort of keep their largely protective status in any of these cases, again, we don't know. So strategies available here. The obvious ones are considering a sort of a diverse range of countries of origin, so sourcing and provide a diverse range of sources. Excuse me. There we go. Stay close to your customs broker, as they will be able to advise you on any other strategies. An example of one being implementing tariff engineering. Excuse me. Implementing tariff engineering, which is where you are able to think about modifying the composition of the of the commodity or the book in order that it gets the most favorable classification possible. Again, that's something that you should only do sort of in consultation with with a licensed US custom broker, and potentially think about aiming to negotiate any longer term contracts with your suppliers on other charges outside of tariffs, so at least you have some stability in those areas to negate any potential volatility when it comes to tariffs. I think that's it before I completely lose my voice, Brian, in terms of planned slides. I've got a few more bits in the background that we can share as and when if the questions are relevant, but yeah, I think that's it for now. Thank you.
Thanks. I think your voice has held up pretty well. The one question that we've already had come in, and we have a couple of others as well, from George, just asking about the impact of the throttling at the Suez Canal. It's not at 100%, so what are the consequences for global trade?
Yeah, that's a good question. There we go. Yeah, so alternative routes around the Cape of Good Hope add cost, transit time, and carbon. The cost of carbon is increased also on those routes. It's something that's been in place for a while, and when I first started making these notes a week ago, I had that wouldn't necessarily be planned to change in the near future, sort of in the immediate future in 2025. However, in the last few days, there's been potentially some progress in peace talks in the Middle East region, and we can only hope that will lead to a potential opening up of the Suez Canal. Yeah, again, not going to make any predictions on Middle Eastern foreign policy, but from a trade perspective, the sooner that we can reopen the Suez Canal, certainly for European trade from the Far East into Europe, the better.
And it sounds like from the brackets of your answer that it's kind of baked into people's current thinking, but it is higher cost, higher transit time, and larger current carbon footprint.
Sorry, I'm listening to shipping.
Let me just take care of that. Just a reminder to folks, if you're in an environment where you don't control the noise or you're on your phone, please do mute yourself.
That's right. It's been baked. Yeah, it's been the normal for over a year now. So it is baked in, and I think until the last week, it was going to continue to be the predicted normal for the majority of 2025. But maybe a slight silver lining, blue sky on the horizon potentially.
This is a little bit further afield from your focus on the book market, but it's a component of book production. Lisa's asking if anyone has information on the aluminum market, particularly with respect to shortages. I don't know if that's something that you would be able to comment on.
I don't know if anybody else does.
There's a comment from Nancy. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and add anything to it, but just with respect to the aluminum market, she suggests subscribing to ThomasNet, which has a daily update that discusses developments in manufacturing.
Thank you. There was an article maybe 2 weeks ago about topography plates in China, and I don't remember the specifics, so that's what led to that question.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, this is Jack's pretty knowledgeable about shipping, but not all commodities.
No. And so what's the role that the aluminum plays in the production process?
It's the plates for printing, so particularly for offset and gravure, the cylinders and for gravure and the plates for offset are made out of aluminum typically.
Okay, it's good to know. Thank you.
Raphael's asking, just saying that his understanding is that religious books are exempt from tariffs in the U.S. market, and just asking the $64,000 question, is there any indication that might change?
Haven't heard that might change, and I discussed this with our brokerage manager yesterday, and the modeling that we're doing is that for that not to change, but again, who knows? But yes, that is the current the current case. Children's and religious texts seem to be excluded. Susie, I don't know if you've got any extra insight on that.
No, I spoke to Kelly about the same thing.
Yeah.
I just think, it would be hard to put a tariff on truly religious books. I mean, there's been some bending of the rules. If you could argue that maybe a kid's book, maybe like a Nancy Drew age book, had Christian holiday stuff in it or Hanukkah stuff in it, that might maybe come into question, but a Bible, I don't think so. I think that's a big, I just don't see it.
I think when the tariffs were first imposed in 2017, there was significant lobbying from different constituent groups like the Evangelical Christian Publishers Association to try and get some of those exemptions, and I think some groups were successful in doing so. But so you can imagine that if additional tariffs are imposed, that there would be certainly some pushback on that. Just a more general question. There's a lot going on in the world. I mean, you covered in relatively short order. I'm just going to mute Dan for a moment. You covered in significant detail, the kinds of things you look at. How is a supply chain participant in the book business, a publisher, a printer, for example, or a retailer able to keep up? I mean, what is a better practice from your perspective?
Yeah, probably with the presidential cycle at the moment, these things have been more in the news than ever before, and it's not been different. It's been harder to avoid probably the factors that are influencing the supply chain than it is to keep up on them at the moment. But in the last couple of years, we, along with all good forwarders, have really upped their game when it comes to regular news releases, press releases, and things like that. So I think just sticking close to your supply chain professional, whether it's a forwarder or a broker or one of your in-house teams, is really important. And secondly, sticking close to your inventory, your product, where things are when and where things are anticipated to be when, so that you can predict potentially ahead of time which of your products might be influenced or impacted should any of these things happen.
And I think maybe a related question, we kind of you're working in a part of the business where fundamentally lead times are extended. People are sourcing from one place and moving either raw materials or finished goods to another. So that you're used to managing businesses with extended lead times. How are some of our, not competitive, but analogous industries dealing with the current environment? I mean, are they taking steps to move volume elsewhere? Are they ordering larger quantities, et cetera?
Yeah, so a couple of things there, and then maybe Mark, you can add if I miss anything. In response to the recent election, we saw a real mix. Some looked to rush as many orders through the door as possible to beat any uncertainty. Others didn't, because they didn't have the capital on hand to be able to increase order volume at such short notice or anything like that. So I think the lesson there is, I guess, we'll wait and see who turned out to be right, but having that flexibility to turn up or turn down production at short notice is an advantage. Second thing that we've seen for a number of years, obviously, is the moving of sourcing, not being so heavily reliant specifically on China and moving to other countries in Southeast Asia and particularly for printing for Europe. I know the sort of next administration's plan is to move a lot of that production back to the US as much as possible. And I don't know how realistic that is, or how for your industry or any others. But I think flexibility, and I know Kevin mentioned this on his session a few weeks ago, sort of that flexibility, diversity, and lack of reliance on one supplier is really key.
Right. Yeah, that very much is part of the global strategy that Scholastic is able to support. Of course, they're at a scale where the capital probably is available, and they can put staff to managing multiple vendors in multiple places. So it's I mean, you mentioned that other folks may have a perspective, so maybe I'll pause there and see if any of your colleagues wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, Mark, and are you seeing any other clients from other sectors doing anything particularly at the moment when it comes to?
Yeah, it's more forward planning and planning on increased lead times just due to shipping transit times that have increased over the past 6 to 8 months. That's what I've seen in other industries.
Thanks. That's really helpful. And I think you talked a little bit about the current environment in the UK and the EU. It feels like you're dealing and we're dealing with a lot more regulatory impact over the last few years. I mean, the EU in particular has kind of rolled in a number of regulations, some of which don't affect shipping and some of which are directly tied to getting goods in and out of the market. Is that your sense as well? And what is the publishing industry rather doing to kind of cope with that?
Thanks, Dave. I don't know if you heard that one. You're on mute, but I'll throw it to you. So Dave's works for WBS, a partner, a long sort of term partner of Woodland, who focus on book distribution in the UK and Europe. So he's the perfect one to answer.
So what we've found lately in work with Woodland and exhibiting at Frankfurt and London book fairs is that there is a lot of printers offering services and solutions to a lot of American and UK publishers. So we're finding a lot of inquiries from small publishers to obviously large publishers looking for solutions for full container loads to part LCL services from these areas going into the USA. Since Brexit, things have changed, but where we as Woodland and WBS together have always been ahead of the game. We have a company called Intel Clear based in France, which assists with smart border crossings between the two, EU and the UK. We're finding that the USA solution for a lot of the goods going out of Europe is coming via the UK for smaller loads, so we could combine and send them to America. We have things in place to assist all sorts of solutions, either by sea or road from the EU, or direct by air as well. So we have solutions for every on the book side of things. We do have solutions for everything. For other commodities, it's a little bit more complicated because of the VAT and duty implications. But the EU, especially into the UK, VAT and duty is free for any printed matter whatsoever.
It's interesting too, because I think that I guess the general rule of thumb is try and find a good local partner in the markets that are either introducing new regulations and or modifying ones that have already been in place, because the ability to understand understanding the EU might be a lot to ask. Only David, you can do that, but to understand what's going on in Europe or in a given market requires kind of local knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, for Europe, for us, it's I mean, we are recognised as the market leader for the publishing sector into pretty much the West, Central, and Eastern Europe, including Turkey and Scandinavia as well. So we're moving from small bookshops orders to like wholesalers throughout Europe and back. So we've good experience within the book market, and with Woodland's expertise in America as well. So we find working together, we're looking to find solutions for all publishers, wholesalers, especially with changing markets, as you've been mentioning earlier today on this webinar. So yeah, I mean, there is a changing market. People are looking to source things in different locations, and so what we found is ourselves and other carriers are all looking to try and find solutions to assist where all these problems are arising through different circumstances. So
and I know
Jack,
that,
you were gonna, sorry, go ahead.
so yeah, in the UK, there's been a focus recently on sort of from the current UK government on shoring up that sort of trading relationship with the EU too. So to try and remove as much of that, like Dave said, for books, there isn't a huge amount of red tape between the UK and the rest of Europe, but for other products there can be. But the UK government's looking to improve that relationship under the current administration. I just hope not to the detriment of the UK-US relationship.
yes, let's hope not.
No.
Yeah.
I have a handful of other questions that I want to ask, and encourage anyone who does want to jump into the chat to add them either to the chat or just raise your hand. One thing that I did want to call out before going on was that Roger Nager, who's actually himself a Lunch and Learn host earlier this year, added a note about the printer plates from China and Japan have been hit with anti-dumping duties, and he provides a link in the chat that you can use as a resource. So, Jack, you talked a little bit about port efficiency. You were kind of just alluding to the U.S. having, if I have the numbers right, in effect, ports that were not even in the top 50 as for measures of efficiency.
Correct. Yeah.
But we're also, and how is efficiency measured? I mean, what kinds of things go into it?
So that measure was sort of throughput per day in terms of number of containers
Right.
per day. So size obviously comes into sort of size of the terminal comes into it there, but some of the New York, New Jersey, and Long Beach and LA ports definitely feature in the top 50 globally for size, but not for efficiency. And it's hard to see how that's going to improve with the unions taking the stance that they've taken. And I think, to be honest, the sentiment that we were seeing in the industry is that people are very sympathetic to the unions when it comes to wages. Everybody expects their union to fight for better wages and conditions. But it seems that they've really missed the mark and not sort of read the room when it came to the being anti-efficient, sort of anti-automation. So yes, it was. We'll have to wait and see how that game of chicken sort of plays out in January when the short-term extension to their contract expires on the 15th of January. And I think it was put even into sort of the inefficiency of the US ports were put even into more stark contrast during that October strike, when we sort of saw on the news and on social media some videos of Scandinavian and Chinese ports that are running more efficiently with far fewer human involvement as well. So it doesn't feel like a long-term solution, and personally, I hope that the unions see some sense there.
Yeah, I read an article around the time that the current wage settlement, the extension was negotiated, that in markets where automation has become pretty successful, that unions and sometimes the companies themselves have negotiated settlements that favored retraining and repurposing, to provide for job growth, but not necessarily in the shipping business.
Yeah, retraining into sort of being remote crane operators, remote truck operators, that kind of thing is what they've been able to do in Scandinavia for sure. And a second measure of efficiency as well as throughput is a measure we call dwell time, which is sort of the amount of time that the container remains at the port. And that's something that is fairly well, there are measures. Yeah, each port publishes their own measures on that. We sometimes question them, but they are published, and we can sort of choose routings based on port congestion. So how many vessels are waiting anchored outside the port for a space, and then dwell time, how long the containers, rise goods wait in the port. So we will sort of work with our clients to prioritize the best route for them based on the most up-to-date congestion and dwell time figures that we have from the ports.
And I imagine that as this is developed over a long period of time, not just years, but probably decades, and probably the solution is not necessarily what happens in January 2025, but what the long-term commitment is. Some of the impact is baked into how we think about lead times, transit times, and the like. But I think what you're describing is a situation where the U.S. market might be becoming comparatively less competitive, and paying the cost either in longer lead times or higher unit costs or both.
Yeah, and we all pay. Yeah, pretty much all imports we pay HMF, the harbour maintenance fee. So it'd be nice to see some return on that investment that every importer pays.
Do you anticipate disruptions in 2025? I mean, you talked a little bit about the planned or anticipated shutdown for Lunar New Year, but are there potential choke points or issues that could come up that in whether it's world events or just simply fragility of the current supply chain?
I'm not sure too much beyond, beyond that planned one in Q1 plus strikes. The concern for me about the potential of the January strike is not the length of the initial strike itself, but the length of any backlog that creates. I think it was sort of anticipating 5 or 6 days of backlog per 1 day of strike. So a 10-day strike puts you sort of near to a 2-month backlog. So that would be one concern. And how long do the carriers wait before they start to look at rerouting, sort of bypassing US ports and rerouting and things like that? So that would be a concern for them, sort of the biggest concern for Q1. Beyond that, I'm not sure of any longer term ones. Although something else that is happening in Q1 next year, and I have a slide actually that I can quickly share.
Go ahead.
Where are we here?
Jack, while you're looking at this one point too, in terms of the pinch points, it's really when we do have the port disruption, the longest it takes, the areas where it takes the longest to recover are the rail points.
Right.
The inland, just as an FYI.
And also, it becomes the domino backwards, and then the truckers start taking advantage, and the CFS stations take advantage. I mean, that all happened, Mark, to us. Really, we had an advantage because of our own CFS stations, but it happened pretty quickly in just a couple days.
Yep.
And so, Jack, do you want to talk a little bit about what you're showing here?
Sure. So, thanks for stepping them up. 2025, in early 2025 is going to be the first sort of big change to some of the existing maritime alliances. So the alliances here refer to the groups of the big ocean carriers who share space on their vessels. As we know, there's only sort of 9 or 10 of those truly global carriers. And they previously existed in those groupings on the left-hand side. And next year, the biggest change is the formation of that red group on the right-hand side, the Gemini Corporation, which is going to come into existence in February next year, which ends the 10-year 2M, so that yellow alliance on the left between Maersk and MSC. And what's interesting here is that Hapag and Maersk in this newly formed Gemini Corporation have set themselves an ambitious target of 90% reliability. So that's 90% of vessels arriving within 2 days, plus or minus 2 days, of their scheduled port arrival time. And the way they're hoping to achieve that is via a hub and spoke model, sort of similar to how like Emirates and Etihad, those sorts of airline carriers have their hub and spoke models in the Middle East. Hapag and Maersk are going to do similar with large sort of shuttle runs between key hubs and then smaller vessels from the key hubs in those spoke runs out to the final destination ports. MSC now splitting out on their own as the only carrier other than Zim to not be part of one of these relationships. MSC are going to focus more on direct port-to-port relationships, so having more direct services and less transshipments than the Gemini Corporation. So 90% reliability would be great. The average is around between 50 and 60% through 2024 so far across all carriers. So yeah, even getting close to 90% from that corporation would be a big improvement.
So this actually, if it works, could be a positive disruption in the sense that it would significantly increase the likelihood of getting your freight at least delivered to a port on time.
Yes, exactly. At least to the port on time. Exactly that.
Actually, I didn't understand that there were these 3 large alliances, and I guess there's still 3 large alliances, but they're just modifying. You know, these companies all operate independently, but then they have essentially cooperation agreements between each other.
That's right. Yeah. Yes.
And
So if you make a book, yeah, you make a booking with one line, for example, the first one there, there's a chance, yeah, just as good a chance that it'll move on a Yang Ming owned vessel, for example.
right.
So it's no different than like the Star Alliance for flying, United, Lufthansa. So it's just like the airline alliances. And not to bring up a bad word, but as we're all talking doom and gloom about the ports, there is an air freight option, and I am seeing it right now with a significant art book publisher that's splitting out orders rapidly, and they're not Christmas orders, to get books out by air from both Asia and Europe. And this is true for David too, for WBS service into Europe, that we can, so to speak, zone skip East Coast or Midwest to the UK, and he takes it by truck on his scheduled service deliveries to the retailers and the wholesalers. So I know no one likes to talk about air freight, but we do a lot of air freight. So just throwing it out there.
I heard Jack loves to talk about air freight.
Is the increase in air freight usage, let alone what the rates are, due primarily to a fear of publishers for tariff avoidance? Is that basically what is driving that, or is there other non-tariff related reasons for what an increase in air freight usage would be?
The air freight, generally when we see air freight, it's because there has been an issue with the lines. There's a number of reasons. There's an issue with the lines or the ports or strikes, and you saw it during COVID. People were desperate for air freight. Or what's happening now in sort of the European model, since we're selling more books in English instead of in the foreign language, some of the publishers are realizing there's actually some economic sense in taking control of their own supply chain to get books into Europe, and to do it fast enough that they've got enough volume, they can ship it to the UK, and then we truck it into Europe on a schedule. So, you know, combination of reasons.
We're
I
finding that
imagine
more and more,
this-
actually. We are finding that more and more. We're getting a lot. In the last year, we've had a lot more support from small and larger publishers, and not just from the USA, but for you, because a lot of the big book distributors, and we have, say, for Romania and other areas, it's very, very fashionable at the moment for young kids to be carrying around book in English rather than their own language. So, and we're finding, like, with the TikTok titles and things like that as well, it's huge the amount what we're moving. So, I mean, we have a system where we can actually still deliver into the Amazon FCs into Europe as well as UK as well. So we're finding a lot more uptake and interest in that areas, which I'll be happy to share with people. Well, not on here, but if they are interested, they can always get in contact with myself or Susie or one of the team.
Thanks. And you probably have seen in the chat that Brooke's been adding your contact information during the chat. The one an observation that sometimes the air freight, particularly at this time of year, may reflect deadlines for trade and mass market sales, because they're particularly mass market is a pretty early delivery. If you miss it, then you're just gone. You're not on sale in that channel. So there could also be a case of, you know, it's the best alternative to maintain sales. Shona was just asking Jack, kind of following up on your slide about alliances, if there is an alliance with the most capacity, or, you know, maybe you were showing them in relative size or relative scale for capacity, and do the alliances have some sort of a geographic focus?
Let me bring the slide back up 1 second.
Thanks. Appreciate that. This is a part of the business I didn't understand before, so you've made me smarter today.
Oh, good. If I can. There we go. The alliance at the top, now called the Premier Alliance.
I think you may not be sharing it yet.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
I'm not seeing it.
It's a two-step
There you go.
process on Zoom.
It's so well, you get used to it, but you're the first speaker we've had that's gone in and out twice. So you
Oh, okay.
created your own challenges. Go
And
ahead.
you can see the right screen, can you? You can see the right slide, yeah?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, the 2M alliance. So I was saying that the alliance at the top, sorry, the 2M alliance here in the middle, the one that's being dissolved, was previously the largest. I don't know actually now whether that makes Hapag and Maersk, the new Gemini Corporation, one of the largest, picking up that MSC volume. In terms of geography, the Ocean Alliance down here has your Far East focus, with COSCO, OCL, and Evergreen all operating out of the Far East. CMA CGM being a European-based carrier too. Yeah, that would be a good thing for me to add into the slide, actually, would be the capacity. So before I send these over to you, Brian, so you can share them, I'll add the relative capacities in there.
And shown the second part of Shona's note was just, is there a geographic focus? Do you go to one for Asia, one for Europe, etc.?
Not particularly on the alliances. Like, we will have certain carriers that we favor for certain routes, but the point of them being alliances is that they each cover off each other's sort of key trading areas. So if Costco, if China to the US is their main lane, the reason that they'll have paired up with CMA as part of the alliance is to cover off a weakness that they have to Europe, for example. So the reason that they form the alliances is to get good global coverage.
Because in effect, everybody's looking for the ability to support a global solution.
Yeah, but I think although Susie's sort of airline analogy earlier was right, unfortunately we don't get frequent flyer miles with an alliance, so we're not necessarily pinned down to an alliance, and we will pick sort of the best carrier per route. And we've been advising you sort of to keep your supplier options open. We do the same with the carriers, and don't put all our eggs in one basket either.
And some people working with Woodland or one of your competitors typically would not necessarily make the decision about which alliance they're using. That's left to you, but you would kind of try to pick the one that made the most sense given the distribution profile for the client you have.
Distribution profile, yeah, that's the best way of putting it.
Generally,
route frequency and volume, we'd sort of be able to pick the best carrier based on those variables. Go on, Susie.
But what I normally do, and we're working on this now for Europe, but to get it exact, or as exact as we can without strikes, is you usually say, can we please have a copy of your purchase order at the time you prepare it, so it's not an extra step. We need to know who the printer is, when it's going to be ready, and in a perfect world we want to know when it's due in inventory. And if we have those two benchmarks, we can make a number of decisions. How to route it meaning what carrier, what line, what alliance, and how many other orders the client has, or how many orders we have going to a specific distribution center like PRH or Simon Schuster or Ingram, where we can form our own consolidation, because the more you have max loaded 40, the lower your landed unit cost is going to be. So it's good if we get that data, those two really key benchmarks, that's driving our decisions.
Okay. And max loaded 40, I imagine, is a full 40-foot container.
Yeah, so
Okay.
can't put more for US. US has different laws for over the road. Like you could get a pretty heavy container down in Tennessee. You get triaxles, but generally speaking, if you use 40,000 pounds for a 40-foot container, that's about it. 19,000 kilos.
I think we're going to do a lunch and learn in the future where everybody comes with their favorite acronyms from the different parts of the business and explains what the shorthand means. But we'll have to stop today. Jack, that actually represents all the questions we have to this point. I want to thank you for putting these thoughts together. And I also want to thank David, Mark, and Susie for joining you and weighing in where your expertise slightly dipped. So
You're welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having us as well.
Thank you.
our pleasure. And for folks who are on the call, we will be distributing the recording probably in about a week. And as you heard, Jack's kind enough to share the slides, and we'll kind of get an updated version from him, and that'll also go out with the recording.
Yeah, I'll include the notes as well, so there's a bit more meat behind the bones.
All right. Thanks again. And thanks again in particular for doing it in your evening, our midday. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.